Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm thrilled to greet you all and welcome you to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, virtual edition. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to Jennifer Norman for live captioning tonight's event. We will paste instructions for viewing those captions in the Zoom chat window now. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. And we have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, including a Black Liberation reading list, our recently concluded second annual literary festival, and much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. Today, we're gathering to talk about fighting for the franchise, a century of struggle for voting rights. This year, and really this week, our conversation takes on a new sense of urgency and importance. Tonight, we're so fortunate to have 4 authors talking about their books and their ideas to help us understand historically how we got to this moment and how we can understand where we might go next. In a moment, we'll introduce Carol Anderson, author of One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. Ari Berman, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Martha S. Jones, author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, co-author of Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing. Way back in the before times, audience members at an event like this would purchase these books at our Schomburg Shop, and then afterwards you'd have the authors sign them for you. But the Schomburg Shop is still going. So today we're going to ask you to purchase them from the Schomburg Shop while supplies last. You can visit schomburgshop.com or use the link that we'll copy in the chat, which goes directly to our public programs page on the Schomburg Shop. Virtual events are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. For example, when we get to the last portion of our agenda, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you will be near the bottom of your Zoom window. Just type your question into that box that pops up, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. You should know this event is being recorded, and it will be available for anyone to view after the fact on the Schomburg's live stream page. We're also live streaming on YouTube, by the way, and so if you know anyone who didn't make it into the Zoom webinar, you can also share the Zoom link that the YouTube link that we'll paste in the chat. But I want you to understand that the default is that all of you watching will remain anonymous in that recording. Only our panelists will be visible and audible. If you pose a question, we'll only use your first name as we're reading out the question to preserve your anonymity. I don't have to reiterate that this is an important discussion. I'm quite certain that we'll get a lot of questions. We hope so, and feel free to type them in at any time. We might not get to all of them though, but we'll do our best. And now I'd like to bring on stage my co-moderator, Brooklyn College Professor of Political Science, Jean Theoharis. Welcome, Jean.
Good evening and welcome. As Brian was saying, this is both not the way we would love to be together at the beautiful Schomburg Center, but it does afford the ability to have people from all across the country, even the West Coast when it's not the evening, to get to be with us tonight. So welcome. It's really exciting to be here, and particularly for this conversation tonight. Conversations in Black Freedom Studies started 8 years ago as a collaboration between me, Sarah Lawrence Professor Kamosi Woodard, and the Schomburg, because there were fewer and fewer sites where we could gather together to hear new work in Black history. Some bookstores had closed, and so this was about returning kind of a role the Schomburg had played for decades as a space where you could go to learn and to hear the kind of latest work. And so that's the idea behind Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. And this is our 8th year. And obviously this is a new form for us, being on Zoom, but it continues to be such an exciting space to get to learn together and to sit together and to see the history that informs where we are today. It is hard to think of something more timely than what we're going to be talking about today, which is the long struggle for voting rights. Conversations of Black Freedom Study, I should say, takes place on the first Thursday of every month. So we will be back in November for a conversation on multiracial solidarities. We will be back in December for a conversation on criminal justice and the prison industrial complex. And again, we're always here the first Thursday of the month at 6:30. But tonight, we are going to be spending the evening with 4 scholars, experts, writers, kind of showing us this long struggle for voting rights as we move into the election. And I'd love to welcome to the stage Professor Carol Anderson, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, Ari Berman, who is a senior reporter for Mother Jones and a fellow at Type Media Center, Martha S. Jones, who is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, and Liz Theoharis, who is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and also my sister. So literally my sister. So welcome. And for those of you who joined us at the Schomburg, we, on the Zoom format, we don't have kind of each person present a more formal presentation because I think Zoom doesn't work so well that way. And so we're going to have a kind of open discussion. And I wanted to start, instead of these formal presentations, just asking each of you for a little bit of background, and particularly since each of you write about the politics and history of voting, how did this get started? What motivated this work? And Professor Anderson, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited to be at the Schomburg. What I came to this work as a human rights scholar. And as a human rights scholar, it has to do with the way that I grew up. I was an Army brat. We moved to Columbus, Ohio. My parents were denied housing because that's not where you people live. And then seeing the struggles that they had in my community, as these were the quintessential God-fearing, hard-working, Americans, and watching the resources being stripped away from that community, watching the destruction of that community as my neighborhood turned into the hood. And I wanted to find out how this happened, because that narrative of a culture of poverty didn't match up with the people that I knew. And that's how I began this hunt through now 4 books. So that's how this happened, yes.
Thank you. Ari, how about you?
Hey everyone, great to be here. I'm really excited to be joined by all of these incredible scholars, incredible women who I've learned so much for. I hope there's no preferential treatment for the sisters, but otherwise I'm very happy to be here. I know Liz, as a God-fearing person, wouldn't tolerate that anyway. So, but I'm really excited to be here and learn from all of you. I've learned so much already from all the people on this panel. For me, I mean, I would like to say that I spent my whole life thinking about the Voting Rights Act and thinking about the civil rights struggle. But honestly, I think I was one of those people that took a lot of this stuff for granted for many years. It wasn't really my direct life experience like it might have been Carol's or somebody else's. And so for me, what really got my attention as a journalist was what happened after the 2010 election, when so many states flipped from blue to red. Places like Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Florida and Wisconsin. And we began to see an unprecedented attempt to restrict voting rights. And it was very clear to me that this was an attempt to nullify the election of the first Black president. And not just to nullify the election of the first Black president, but to nullify the coalition that elected him. Young people, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, progressive whites, all coming together. I mean, to me, that was the vision that Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Lyndon Johnson had when the Voting Rights Act was passed, that we would not just have different kind of people elected, but we'd have different kinds of coalitions electing them. And so to see Republicans try to turn that back, not by trying to persuade people of a different outcome, but by trying to prevent them from voting, just seems so fundamentally wrong to me. So that's how I first started covering it as a journalist. And then when the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act, I began asking people very basic questions about the Voting Rights Act, like, what did it do? Why is it still being challenged? What should I read to get up to speed on the Voting Rights Act? And I was really surprised that no one had really written a book about what the Voting Rights Act had done. And I realized there had been so much written about the events that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but so little about what came after it. It felt like we were frozen in history in the way that we discussed voting rights, that we always talked about what happened in 1965, but never what happened in 75 or 85 or 95 or 2015, right? And so that's what really led me to get a whole lot deeper into this subject as a journalist and kind of become both a journalist and an amateur historian of this topic. And ever since then, it's pretty much been off to the races.
Wonderful. Martha, how about you?
Thanks so much, Jean. And thanks to everybody at the Schomburg for including me in this conversation. I really appreciate your question because I realized I hadn't really thought about it. So I'll say that on the one hand, many years ago in the 1980s, I was a public interest lawyer on the Lower East Side of New York City, where there was a large armory that had become a shelter for homeless people. And in the mid-1980s, New York City voting officials began to refuse to permit homeless people living in that shelter from registering to vote because they were said to be without an address. And one of the very first cases I worked on as a young lawyer was that voting rights question. So fast forward to a very different moment, but not so different, right? I think that's the point, right? Is that voter suppression has never left us. I was piqued by a proposal to install a monument to early women's suffragists in New York City's Central Park, one that featured Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, other women's names were proposed to be on a scroll that unfurled at their feet. And I realized we were careening into an anniversary year, 2020, 100 years since the 19th Amendment had been ratified, and we were remarkably and deeply disturbingly at risk to have African-American women, their history, their politics, and more erased from that commemoration. Racism was at risk for being erased from that commemoration in the effort to style it as a celebration and not as a serious moment for extending our understanding and recommitting to our politics around voting rights. So I did something I'd never done before and said I would write a book, and I would write it in short order. I would stand on the shoulders of the many Black women's historians who have been working on this subject for a very long time and try and change the conversation in 2020.
Thank you. And Liz?
Yeah, so thanks so much. It's so good to be here. And I'm so honored to be with everybody that's in this conversation tonight. And it's amazing to be at the Schomburg. And so, as Jean is my sister, we were raised in a family that was deeply politically active in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I remember being at protests at age 3, canvassing and organizing for progressive candidates really my entire life. I went to school in first grade really convinced that Mondale Ferraro had won because we had dedicated so much energy into that campaign that and so much hope. So then I kind of joined a movement of poor and homeless people in the early 90s. That was an organizing drive of poor and homeless people, the National Union of the Homeless, who worked really hard with amazing lawyers and were able to win the right to vote for homeless people because of that militant organizing and because of that kind of radical lawyering. And so, you know, it was really, you know, amongst homeless folks that were fighting to be represented and to, you know, and I also come out of a human rights movement, a welfare rights movement, where we would run our own candidates, you know, trying to have folks who had experienced poverty, who had experienced homelessness, that knew what it was to be without healthcare, and felt like this democracy should be for everybody. And so then the last, you know, 3 years, but really 25 years have been, you know, helping to chair and organize with the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival, where we really start with the question of voter rights, where we really start with making connections between racist voter suppression, racist voter suppression laws, and our impoverished democracy, and see. And so much of that work, you know, that started off, you know, as at a really young age for myself, but then especially inspired by organized poor people in this country who have been in the forefront, I think, always historically, those that are most impacted by the injustices that we're trying to solve, who have always insisted that that we need this right, and that we have to fight and organize and protest and mobilize to keep on keeping it.
Thank you. So now we're at the part of the program where you're going to teach us some stuff, right? And so I think where we want to start is with each of you giving us an example, and it can be historical or more contemporary historical, of voter suppression and voting rights abridgment that people might not know, right? And I think, Martha, I want us to start with you. So give us an example that you think helps us think about this history of voting rights abridgment.
Well, I'm going to take us to 1920 and the moment when the 19th Amendment is on the road to be ratified. I think many of us have been exposed to the myth that the 19th Amendment gave American women the right to vote. It's the amendment in which American women won the right to vote. Maybe you've even heard that it guaranteed American women the right to vote. None of that is true because, of course, in the road to 19th Amendment, there is a dirty bargain. And the dirty bargain of the 19th Amendment is that the members of Congress who promulgate that amendment, the state legislatures that ratify it, the suffragists that lead that movement, all know that there's nothing in the 19th Amendment that will prevent individual states from now disenfranchising Black American women the way they have already for decades been disenfranchising African American men. There is nothing in the 19th Amendment that will interfere with the intimidation and violence that is already keeping Black men from the polls and will surely do the same to African American women. So the story I try and tell in Vanguard is about, in part, how African American women respond to that. But the short answer is that in 1920, Black women, now in partnership with Black men, have to begin a voting rights movement anew in 1920, one that will take 45 years and bring us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For me, and I hope for others who read Vanguard, the lesson in part is that 1920 is hardly the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new and critical movement for voting rights in this country.
Thank you. And just to kind of go back to something that Brian said right at the beginning, which is that we're not physically together, so we can't go physically to the shop and get the books and have everyone sign it, but you still can go to the shop online. They've put the link in the chat. All of their books are there. Obviously, you can see the beautiful Vanguard in the back of Martha's screen. So please use that link to go to the shop and get it. Carol, how about you? Give us an example, teach us.
And so I'm going to go to the Mississippi Plan of 1890. Because here what you have happening in Mississippi is you have poor Blacks and poor whites who are mobilizing, organizing, and voting together because they are sick and doggone tired of the way that the policies have them working from can't to can't, and they still can't. And so they are working to put in and elect officials who really give a rat's tail about the working poor. Well, the power brokers in Mississippi looked at this and said, it was like a Scooby-Doo moment. Oh, Shaggy. They were like, we cannot have this. And what they came up with, though, is because now after the Civil War, you have this thing called the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, that says the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so Mississippi can't write a law saying, we don't want Black folk to vote. But what they really want to do is say, we don't want Black folk to vote, and be really clear about that. And Big Chief Jim Vardaman is really clear about that's what they really want. And so how do you say, we don't want Black folk to vote without saying it? And what they decided to do was to use the legacies of slavery, those societally imposed conditions born of hundreds of years of servitude, followed by the Black codes, followed by sharecropping, to make it clear to use those societally imposed conditions as the access to the ballot box. What they had figured out is that as long as we don't write a law saying we don't want Black folk to vote, but it's going to have that effect, we think that what we will be able to do is to dance around the 15th Amendment while trampling on the Constitution. So what they came up with were things that sounded reasonable in that language, for instance, of we really are trying to protect the integrity of the ballot box. We want to end corruption in our elections. And so who could be for wanting corruption in your elections? So it sounds reasonable. So they say a poll tax. A poll tax, because democracy is expensive, and we just think that it would ought to be able to fund this election. And because if you really cared about democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee. Well, when you have had systemic poverty born of slavery, born of sharecropping, born of Black codes, to be able to come up with what amounted to 2 to 6% of a farm family's annual income to be able to vote was a way to really just say, we don't want Black folk to vote. There are other issues, such as methods, such as the literacy test, et cetera. But the impact of this is that, and this thing spread because the US Supreme Court said that the poll tax and the literacy test in a case in 1898 did not violate the 15th Amendment, because everybody had to pay the poll tax, and did not violate because everybody had to read, had to take this literacy test. By the time we get to 1940, in the Second World War, this war against the Nazis, only 3% of age-eligible Black adults were registered to vote in the South. That was legal. So we have to begin to understand the ways that you get this manipulation of the synonyms of race, and using these foundational systemic inequalities as a way to block access to the ballot box. That's what takes us to what I call now Jim Crow 2.0.
Thank you. Liz, do you want to pick that story up?
Yeah, so I'm so appreciating this history, and want to talk a little bit about history, but in the last, 7 to 10 years. And think a little bit about, what Ari mentioned in his opening around the voter suppression laws that have been enacted in the 26 states since 2013. And there hasn't been nearly enough conversation about them. There's a little bit more with the passing of John Lewis and in this election, and folks are finally starting to talk a little bit about the impact it had on the 2016 election, and the impact it's having on this election. But even when we do talk a little bit about the fact that there are 26 states in this country that have fewer voting rights than 54 years ago, we don't always draw the connection then to the impact that it has on the very people Carol was just talking about, but from generations past, right? Where who gets basically smuggled into office because of these racist voter suppression laws, then turns around and blocks the expansion of Medicaid, which of course is all up for attack right now. But are the states that have the highest poverty, the highest child poverty, the highest women in poverty across race, actually. They're the states that have the fewest LGBTQ protections. They're the states that have the most money going to the military. They're the states with the fewest environmental protections. And so what you see in an attack on voting rights in our present, just like in our past, but an attack on voting rights is an attack on the poor, it's an attack on women, it's an attack on Indigenous people, it's an attack on people of color, and it makes the connections because what we're seeing, is those that are impacted by racist voter suppression, in some states are more poor white people, but disproportionately in numbers and percentages are people of color. But you see that how suppressing the right to vote, and particularly targeting communities of color, targeting Black Americans, targeting Latinos, targeting Indigenous communities, shutting down poll places, having these like a new poll tax in terms of re-enfranchising felons, whether it's all of the different ways that we're basically attacking our democratic rights in the present day. It then has such an impact. And so, if we want to talk about, intersectionality, we have to start with looking at the way that voter suppression and the attack on voting rights has happened over the past 10 years. And we then need to all come together and do something about it. And we can, because again, we have these moments in history when people have, and we have people doing it now.
Ari, maybe you can finish up this little section on voter suppression and voting rights, history of voting rights abridgment.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples from history and the present day. My brain is just filled with them, unfortunately, at the moment, at all hours of the day and night. But I want to talk about an election that's been on my mind a lot for good reason, which is the 2000 election in Florida. And I want to talk about what happened in that election, but not what you think happened in that election. So everyone remembers the hanging chads and the butterfly ballots and Catherine Harris and elderly Jews mistakenly voting for Pat Buchanan and the 37-day recount between George W. Bush and Al Gore. But there was another part of that election that got almost no attention at the time and is still very poorly understood, which is that in the run-up to the election, Florida did a massive voter purge. And they claimed first off that there was massive fraud, which there was not. Then they compiled a list of people with past felony convictions that they said were unable to vote. Now, Florida at the time was one of a handful of states that prevented people with past felony convictions from voting. This went all the way back to the end of the Civil War, the period that Carol was talking about, where after the Civil War, there's this huge enfranchisement of Black people in Florida. And Florida suddenly has more Black than white registered voters for the first time in its history. And Florida decides that they're going to reject the white power structure that's still in power despite a black majority, decides that they are going to reject the 14th Amendment. They're not going to rejoin the Union. And the only way that they can rejoin the Union is to say, we're not going to suppress the vote anymore. So they join the Union, but suddenly there's all of these black registered voters. So they say, what do we do? They have to figure out a way of suppressing voters, like Carol said, without actually saying they're suppressing them. So what they do is they say, anyone who has a felony can't vote anymore. And by the way, we're going to massively expand the list of felonies to all these ridiculous charges like vagrancy or like stealing a chicken, like really ridiculous things, and loitering, things like that. And we're only going to charge basically African Americans with these crimes. So suddenly, all of the newly enfranchised African Americans are kicked off the voting rolls. And that's how Florida's felon disenfranchisement scheme begins and ushers in Jim Crow. And actually, these felon disenfranchisement laws are put into effect even before some things like poll taxes and literacy tests and other devices are adopted in Florida later, like in the 1890s and 1900s and right after that. So fast forward to the present day in 2000. So Florida does this voter purge, and it's incredibly inaccurate. And basically the Republican officials in Florida are saying, make it so that it encompasses as many people as possible. So there's all of these what's called false positives. So basically all these people are labeled as felons, even if they're not felons. And they show up on election day and they're told, you're a felon, you can't vote. It turns out there's litigation after the election. And the state of Florida concedes that 12,000 registered voters were wrongly labeled as felons and prevented from voting. That's 22 times George W. Bush's margin of victory in that state. And African Americans are 14% of the electorate in Florida, but 44% of those on the voter purge list. So that purge alone cost Al Gore the election, most likely. Not to mention the recount that occurred after, in which John Roberts and Ted Cruz and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and all the people that are now dominating the Supreme Court and dominating American politics go down to Florida to prevent votes from being counted. And the reason I tell this example, because it's a very, very disturbing example of both how voter suppression impacts elections, how it's racially discriminatory, and how it gets swept under the rug to the point that even now, if you ask the average person what happened in Florida 2000, they don't even know that this is an actual thing. So I'm very concerned about this history repeating itself, both in terms of the impact of suppression and also, of course, what might happen if this goes to the courts as well.
Thank you. So at the same time that we have this more than a century of history that, again, we've gotten a little taste of kind of voting rights abridgment and voter suppression, we also have an equally long history of activism, of people fighting, organizing, coming together to try to prevent to prevent this stuff from happening and to expand and make real kind of the promises of this democracy. So, Carol, start us off. Give us an example. Again, tell us a story we don't know of this, like more than a century of struggle, of courage, of what we can do.
So I'm going to start us off in 1901 and have us end up in 2017. And I'm going to do it in 2.6 seconds. No. But in 1901, Alabama revised its constitution. It was part of that wave of Jim Crow constitutions that were coming up in these states. And it had a clause in there, building off of Ari, moral turpitude. If you have been convicted of a crime of moral turpitude, you have lost your right to vote. But there was no law on the books about moral turpitude. So you didn't quite know whether your conviction was moral turpitude, but you knew that if you got out of prison and you tried to vote, and then if the state official said, oh, but you've been convicted of a crime of moral turpitude, you were going back to prison. So it was a way where you've got this opacity about, can I don't know, and the risks are too great, I don't know what to get. And so you would end up having decades of civil society going in and suing the crap, I believe that's the scholarly term, out of Alabama to define moral turpitude. Eventually, in the spring of 2017, so remember, we're talking about 1901. In the spring of 2017, finally, Alabama's legislature defines moral turpitude. Rape, murder, treason, some other things, but those are the biggies. What's not there? Drug charges. And so in this moment, all of civil society had been working so hard for this moment, lobbying, pressuring, it is like, whoa, we are there. So they turn to Secretary of State John Merrill, who believes that the right to vote is not really a right at all, but actually a privilege. And they say to John Merrill, all of those folks that you told that they had lost their right to vote, now tell them they have their right. And all of those folks, 8% of Alabama's adult population was not able to vote because of moral turpitude. 15% of its Black adult population was blocked from the ballot box because of moral turpitude. So this is no small thing. And also remember, in December of 2017, there is a special election for the US Senate with the race between Doug Jones and Judge Roy Moore. This is no small thing. And so when John Merrill went, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not telling all those folks. I don't think that's a good use of state resources. Civil society rose up and they created what they called restoration clinics. They figured out to send out the word via the different kinds of media. Radio for old folk like me, social media for young folk, to send the word out. If you have been convicted, you might actually have your voting rights back. Come to the clinic. And they set up the first one in the church in Selma. And they had a team of lawyers going through the records, saying, nope, not moral turpitude, not moral turpitude, not moral turpitude. And then they had a team of volunteers working through all of the obstacles that Alabama had put in place to be able to register to vote, to get those folks registered to vote. That activity, that action, that determination, and they knew that there were some folks who were not going to step foot in a church. So they actually had a caravan that went to poor communities doing the same thing that they had originally launched in Selma. It was a game changer. Thousands upon thousands of people who were registered to vote, got their voting rights back. So you see the power of the state trying to shut folks down, and you see the power of the people fighting back to get their voting rights. I love that story.
I love that story too. Liz.
Yeah, so I want to talk again a little bit more about the present and some of the powerful, organizing that is actually very connected to those restoration clinics in Alabama, to that, and that's like looking a little bit at who has the power to actually shift our political landscape. And so last month, the Poor People's Campaign released a study, actually, and I think I want to show a couple of things from it. So we released a study. It's called "The Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans: Changing the Political Landscape." A professor at Columbia, did the research, with us and for us, and helped us put this out. But it basically kind of confirms what we've been saying for a long time. And suspected for a long time, but have more data to show it now, which is that it's not that poor people are who brought us Donald Trump. It's not that, that people are just voting against their interests necessarily, but that actually, if in 15 states, and I think there's a, if we could look at the next graphic, in 15 states, in the 2016 election, that the percentages that you see, like 1% in Michigan, 19% in North Carolina, 7% in Florida, if just that percentage of eligible poor and low income voters were to vote around an agenda, they would have exceeded the margin of victory for Donald Trump. And so 15 states could, and then if we look at I have another graphic, and this is about looking at the state elections. This is in the midterms, right? That there are 16 states from the midterm elections where if eligible, but at this point non-voting poor and low income people come out and vote around an agenda of healthcare, agenda of living wages, agenda of actual real police reform, an agenda around immigrant rights. I mean, many of the issues that folks are kind of real life and death issues for people, that poor people hold the key to shifting the entire political landscape. Now we know why poor people haven't been engaged as much. It's the racist voter suppression laws. It's the closing of polling places. It's the kind of modern poll taxes. It's the moral turpitude interpretations and how that's been used against our communities. It's also because folks lack transportation. There's not election day isn't a holiday. And folks are, have to figure out what to do with the kids or can't get off of work. But also because for now decades, really, so many of our elected candidates and officials just do not speak in a visionary way to the needs and demands of poor and low income people. And so I think there's some really amazing activism and organizing going on right now in this election, because our democracy depends on it. And that comes out of a long history, a history that again connects in Alabama, surely for hundreds of years. But two, mobilizing and organizing and registering and educating poor and low income people, building this new electorate, and being able to actually shift the entire political landscape this way. And so, of course, as a leader in the Poor People's Campaign, there's lots of ways that people can get involved in some of that really historic work now, whether it's poll monitoring, whether it's, some of the lawsuits that we're having to file in the face of voter suppression cases that are happening now, but also in terms of actually turning out and connecting with poor people who have the power to actually really change, have historically and currently do. And so, to me, it's really helpful to kind of have that, both a long view, but then to see the potential for change, and not just thinking, okay, things are just getting so bad and they're only going to get worse. But it doesn't have to be this way. And again, we can see in this building and coming together of a new electorate, this possibility for change now.
Ari, tell us a story, one of your favorite stories about kind of like the long struggle for voting rights.
So I want to tell a story about a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who is one of the martyrs of the movement for voting rights in Selma. Again, not a name that a lot of people outside this circle really know, but someone I thought a lot about over the summer, and particularly when John Lewis passed. So at the same time, there was this big movement for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. In 1965, it was happening in the surrounding counties as well. And in the county next door to Selma, in Perry County, Alabama, there was a march for voting rights. I think it was February 18th, 1965. And it was a night march, which was very, very dangerous back then. And in fact, when I went back to Alabama, I drove at night from Selma to Marion, Alabama, on these little tiny back roads. And it was very, very dark, no lights, nothing. And I thought about just how terrifying it must have been if you were Black back then to do that and know that what if the police stopped you? What if you ran into the Ku Klux Klan? What if your car broke down and you asked a white neighbor for help and they were actually a member of the White Citizens Council? So in 1965, there's this night march in Marion, Alabama, and Alabama state troopers attack the night marchers, and they flee into this little cafe, and the Alabama state troopers start attacking an old man and his daughter. And Jimmy Lee Jackson, who is a 25-year-old Black man, he's the youngest deacon at his church. He tries to register to vote 5 times and is denied each time. He tries to break up the Alabama state troopers from beating his mother and his grandfather, and they shoot him. And he later dies at the hospital. And they go to the hospital while he's in there before he dies, and the Alabama state troopers serve him with a warrant for his arrest for attacking a police officer when in fact they were the ones who killed him. And the activists in Selma are so frustrated by this point. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, has been there since 1963 trying to register Black voters. The number of Black voters in Selma has gone from 150 to 300 out of 15,000 Black voters. So people are getting arrested every single day, but nobody is getting registered. Martin Luther King starts going to Selma in January of 1965 and giving all these amazing speeches at Brown Chapel. No one is getting registered. And people are just fed up with the disenfranchisement and the killing of Black people in the Jim Crow South. And so a number of activists, I forget who has the idea, I think it's James Bevel has the idea, that they are gonna march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, holding Jimmy Lee Jackson's casket to dramatize the disenfranchisement and the murder of Black people in the Jim Crow South. They don't end up doing that. That's too logistically complicated, but that is really where the inspiration for the Bloody Sunday March comes from. And I went back to Marion, Alabama, right before the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and I heard C.T. Vivian preach at a little church there about Jimmy Lee Jackson. And what happened this summer was C.T. Vivian passed away, I think 3 days before John Lewis. And when everything was going on with George Floyd, I thought back to Jimmy Lee Jackson. And I basically thought that Jimmy Lee Jackson was to the voting rights movement in Selma like George Floyd has been to the movement for racial justice today. And it both makes you really discouraged because you're thinking 55 years later, we're dealing with the same issues. We're dealing with disenfranchisement. We're dealing with murder. We're dealing with police brutality. But at the same time, you see these horrible deaths become a movement for action. And so that's the uplifting part of the story. That's what I take from it that gives me some hope for the future.
Thank you. Martha, can you tell us a story, one of your favorite?
I'm going to take us to Florida in 1919 and 1920 and introduce the figure of Mary McLeod Bethune. Bethune is an educator. She's a suffragist. She's a club organizer. And by 1919, she's part of a statewide campaign that is being waged in Florida to register, educate, and otherwise get Black Floridians to the polls. Bethune anticipates the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and her focus is on the Black women of Florida. It is an extraordinarily brutal campaign, not for the work of Black Americans, but for the organized violence that is wrought upon them by the Ku Klux Klan throughout the state, violence that goes unchecked, unaddressed, unprosecuted, and more. But Bethune is extraordinarily successful in getting Black women registered. It's part of the ways in which Black women are working deliberately with the knowledge that the 19th Amendment is not intended to get them to the polls. Suffrage schools, citizenship schools. How do I pay a poll tax? What is a literacy test? Let's read that Constitution together so that we can face down reluctant officials. Bethune is doing that work. She does it to such great effect that as election eve of 1920 approaches, the Ku Klux Klan announces its intention to come to her hometown of Daytona, Florida, and to confront prospective Black voters. The Klan certainly arrives as promised in full regalia on horseback after having burned a cross in the river. And they march to the campus of Mrs. Bethune's girls' school, what is today Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona. They march onto the grounds, and it is an effort to intimidate Mrs. Bethune. It is an effort to intimidate her faculty. It is an effort to intimidate all of the Black women of Daytona who had followed her lead and had registered to vote. The faculty stares them down, is how the story goes, and the Klan heads off without a direct confrontation. And the next morning, the Black women of Daytona turn out en masse. And this is part of their strategy in order to thwart violence, in order to thwart intimidation. It's necessary to come to the polls in numbers with one another to construct a kind of safety, a kind of bulwark in their numbers. And indeed, the Black women of Daytona will cast their ballots in 1920, despite the intimidation that has been visited upon them. But by 1922, the Klan again will visit Daytona and march on Mrs. Bethune's school yet again, and the violence is relentless. So part of the lesson from Mrs. Bethune's experience is in the ground game, right? That Black women can get registered, right? Can face down intimidation and violence, but it comes as a tremendous cost. And part of what we know is that in the wake of that violence, she will shift tactics and head to Washington, D.C. She will find her way to become an extraordinarily effective political operative by way of patronage, by way of lobbying, by way of her collaborations with the Roosevelts. She's someone who learns how to move, that disenfranchisement, even the brutality of violence, does not cause her to fold up or to go home. It causes her to read the landscape and to develop a new set of tactics in the heart of Jim Crow, in the thick of disfranchisement and violence. And so part of the lesson, I think, for me, is that we have to be that nimble. We have to be that creative. We have to be able to read the landscape and do the work in real time under real conditions. Bethune never abandons voting rights at all, but she understands that that's a long game and that her community cannot wait until 1965 and a Voting Rights Act. They need her to be securing resources, to securing safety and much more. And she's going to do that by heading to Washington.
Thank you. We are getting close to the time for the Q&A. And we have a few questions already in the Q&A function in your window. So if you're watching this and you're having questions, what always happens is that people have all their questions at the end and it's hard to get to them. So be one of the early people to type in a question, and you're more likely to have your question read out. But before we get to those questions, start typing. Let me ask a couple that have come to my mind as I'm listening to you speak. And I love the way there are notes of what you might call hope and horror in everything that you're saying, recounting this history. And I just remember that quote from Dr. King, you know, about the arc of the moral universe. Actually, I don't know if that's from Dr. King, but maybe we'll throw this to you, Liz, first. How do we understand this week in light of this history? Where is that moral arc bending? Is it justice? Is it injustice? I mean, what do we tell our children? And you know, this is a country that always wants to say it's getting better. It's always a message of progress. And we know it's a lot more messy than that, certainly. But how do you think about where we are right now in 2020? Where are we given in light of this history?
I mean, this election matters a whole lot. And it matters because, you know, our very democracy is really in question. But I actually am very hopeful, not because of the performance on Tuesday night, not because of, you know, the further attacks on the courts and the stacking of the courts, but because what's always happened in history is that people, when their backs are against the wall, are left with no choice but to push, right? And what we're seeing, you know, in 2019 in Kentucky, there was a governor's race, and you know, folks just write off Kentucky, right? I mean, McConnell's been there 34 years, right? I mean, he's blocking all of this stuff, right? But there was a governor's race, and the very counties that have kept McConnell in office, some of them that voted for Trump to be in there, put forward, you know, voted for on a governor across, you know, what they say, from the hood to the holler, right? You know, a real fusion movement, you know, of former coal miners and artists and folks living in the mountains and folks that are in Louisville, you know, connected to the family of Breonna Taylor, to folks in Lexington, who all came together and put out an agenda, and that is who came into office in Kentucky, right? And we can't write off what people whose backs against a wall are willing to do in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of an economic crisis, in the midst of really the rise and the emboldening of white supremacy, right? The people aren't having it. And what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, you know, when we pulled together, you know, less than 2 weeks ago, a voter protection and participation, you know, more than 1 million poor and low income people joined, right? And are getting trained about, you know, across racial lines, across geographic lines, trying to find out where do people stand on healthcare, like really, not, you know, and not just being, you know, baited towards these issues that aren't the real issues that have been exposed because of this pandemic, because of the murdering, the continued murders at the hand of the state of Black bodies. But you know, people are in movement, and we need to be, and people, you know, better be. But there is horror, there is deep horror, and we have to mourn, and we have to. But then, you know, we have to keep on organizing, and people are, and if you're not hearing that people are, and we need to have so many more people involved.
Ari, you raised this about fighting the same battles, and sometimes that doesn't feel good. It feels like we're treading water or going to, how do you assess this?
I think we've been fighting the same battles for a long time in this country, and the same people have often been fighting them throughout history. I think the quote is probably more accurate when you think of the arc of history bending towards justice, but often abruptly snapping back right when it's bending. that in fact, the greatest moments of progress in our history are often followed by the most intense periods of retrenchment, while those who are displaced from power are doing everything they can to hang on to it. And so if you study what happened after the Civil War, when Black majorities are followed by these crazy right-wing supremacist minorities that are ruling for decades, it's not surprising, if you know that history, to understand that someone like Trump would follow someone like Obama, and that the first Black president would be followed by such an openly racist president. I mean, so much more openly racist than even Nixon or Reagan, not to mention Bush or someone like that, who seem like champions of civil rights compared to our current president. But I mean, I think the stakes are so big in this election that basically, to me, it boils down to, we're either going to be a democracy or we're not. That if Trump is reelected, and if there is a 6-3 Republican majority, conservative, right-wing conservative majority on the Supreme Court, if we have another decade of crazy gerrymandered state legislatures, if we have white supremacists emboldened, I don't think it's going to resemble anything that we think of as a democracy. And if we don't have that, it's not like everything's going to be suddenly better. But I think we're going to get back to expanding voters' participation and having checks and balances and having respect for basic rule of laws. So, I mean, to me, those are the stakes here. And I don't know if we've ever really had those stakes quite so blunt, certainly not in my lifetime. And I don't know what other election, Carol, Martha, others, I don't know what election you can point to when the stakes were quite so high for what it means if we're going to be a democracy or not.
Martha, what do you think?
It's hard for me to subscribe to the arc metaphor, frankly, especially when we're in a conversation about voting rights in this country. I just don't think history bears that out, that we are in, I think it is a regular, permanent, perhaps, feature of this democracy, that we are in an internal battle over fundamental things like who is a citizen, who votes. And I think in every generation, there is an important, consequential confrontation with these questions. And we are here in 2020 confronting our own. I do want to say something about the president's remarks the other night, however, not wanting to subscribe to him any sense or insight about history. But of course, his remarks do remind us that the history of violence is a companion to the history of voting rights, that when we say voter suppression, we ought not to mistake that for anything other than the exacting of violence on the lives of Black Americans, whether it's state violence or vigilante terrorist violence, that is part of the story that the president may or may not know, but I know everyone here on this panel tonight does. I think what the president doesn't likely know, right, is that we have been here before, and that Americans, including Black Americans, like Mary McLeod Bethune, show up the next day to vote, even when visited upon by the Ku Klux Klan under cover of night. That is the lesson, I think, that was not evidenced in those remarks. And to me, I certainly am someone who aspires for my children, for my grandchildren, a different kind of nation. The women I write about know this is a long game, and know that many of them, the great sheroes of the early 20th century struggle for voting rights, do not live to see the Voting Rights Act, but they understand what they bequeath to us. I had someone ask me the other night I was at the National Civil Rights Museum, and our colleague, Dr. Noelle Trent, passed on to me a question that had been asked of her, which was, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And that really was clarifying for me, in the sense that it is never a question of what is the outcome in any election cycle, or even perhaps what is the outcome in my lifetime. That my commitment has to be, right, to the conditions, right, that struggle vigilantly against the perhaps inevitable, I don't want to put words in Ari's mouth, right, but perhaps the inevitable snapping back of that arc. My work, right, is to, in this moment, combat that, hope for better, but do that real work in real time.
Thank you. Carol?
I'm sorry, the way that I feel about that man and his enablers, this really is an election that to me is as consequential as the one in 1860. It is an election that is going to define who we are and who we aren't. It is an election that's going to help us understand whether we're going to be fighting forward or whether we're going to be fighting a rear guard action, trying to maintain and hold on to some semblance of what we once had, so that we can at least not build from the abyss. That's where we are. And in him and in his enablers, you see him tapping into that long, nasty vein of white supremacy that has been in constant conflict with the aspirational notions, declarations of who this nation is and what this nation is. And folks like Mary McLeod Bethune and Mary Church Terrell and Jimmy Lee Jackson, they fought on the plane of aspirations. That's where they fought, on that plane. And what this regime is designed to do is to destroy aspirations so you don't even hope. So you think that this is as good as it's going to get. And if you dare think that you can hope, we are going to bring violence down upon you. And we are going to use all of the levers of government, plus the vigilantes that I have been courting since birtherism, since I put the death penalty for the Central Park 5 ad up. And this is where we say, son, you don't know my name. When you think about how intense this fight has been, when you think about the ways, the strategies, the tactics that we have developed to take on this violence, the bureaucratic violence and the physical violence. And I see it. I see it in the organizing. I see it in the folks out in the street. And I see it in the folks in Louisville banging on the doors, let me in so I can vote. I see it in the 5-hour lines here in the midst of a pandemic in Georgia, where folks are determined to vote. I see it when the US Supreme Court on April 6th says that if you don't have your absentee ballot, in order for it to count, has to be postmarked by tomorrow, when tens of thousands of people have not received their absentee ballot. And those folks stood out in line, basically facing a coronavirus firing squad. So when he doesn't know history, he's not educable, He's not even trainable. So he's got to go. And that is what's on the ballot in November. It is the beginning of our reclamation project here in the United States.
Thank you. All right, we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to read some out. I think I'm going to read 3 at once and let you kind of put them together because they're resonant and they have connections to each other. Khalid writes, what particular changes do you think voting will bring to the marginalization of minorities in the United States? Exceptionally in the case of the upcoming election. I don't know if that means especially in the case of the upcoming election or the upcoming election accepted, but interpret it as you will. And also I'm not sure what that question means, but one way to read it might be, what do we get from the vote? And I know that in the process of trying to win social change, we don't get everything that we want on the ballot directly. So what do we get from voting? And you've spoken to that already in some ways. An anonymous attendee writes, do you feel that real political change needs to be achieved on the local level first and work its way up? Or do you believe that a more top-down approach is best, starting with the federal government and trickling down to the local level? And lastly, Anne asks, do you feel the electoral college is a tool of voter suppression, disenfranchisement, and should it be abolished? Ari, let's start with you. And pick among them.
I'm going to take the third question and leave the others for the rest of the panel. Yes, the Electoral College is a form of voter suppression. It is a form of disenfranchisement, and it violates basic notions of one person, one vote. We don't have an electoral process where everyone's vote counts equally for president. We have an election in which me living in New York, my vote for president basically doesn't matter because we know that New York is going to go blue. Not only that, but the Electoral College is based on the House and the Senate. House districts are drawn by state legislatures who are often extremely gerrymandered. So you're talking about gerrymandering impacting the House. Then you're talking about the Senate, where someone in Wyoming has 68 times the voting power of someone in California, where 30 states elect 60 senators and have the same population as California, which elects 2 senators, and where basically the current Republican Party represents fewer people than the Democrats, but have ability to confirm Supreme Court justices for life. So the basic structure of the Electoral College both disenfranchises people and rests on fundamental inequities in American politics. And you just get deeper and deeper and deeper in a hole when you combine all of these unresponsive and unrepresentative structures together. So we absolutely should have an election in which everyone votes count. It wouldn't be a Democratic plot. Someone in Wyoming's vote doesn't really matter for president either. They have really no incentive to vote for president, in the same way that I really have no incentive to vote for president. I'm going to vote. Obviously, I cover voting rights for a living, but you can't tell me my vote matters in this election as much as Carol's vote matters, being in Georgia, which now is luckily a swing state. For many years, it didn't really matter there either until recently. And so I just want to put that out. The second thing I just want to quickly say is the importance of state and local races. And I just want to mention one thing, and then others can pick up on this, is the importance of state legislative races in 2020. This isn't getting any attention, but in most states, state legislatures draw voting districts for the next decade. And so the state legislatures that are elected in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, et cetera, they are the ones that are going to draw voting maps for the next decade. And so who you vote for in your state legislative level matters tremendously. And those are elections that are decided by 10,000 votes, not 50 million votes. So it's a lot easier to impact. People are looking for something to do. It's a lot easier to impact a state legislative race than a presidential race. And the legislative maps are based on the 2020 census, which also isn't getting any attention now, but is totally under threat. And it's either going to end October 5th, which is when the Trump administration wants to end it, or it's going to end October 31st when the courts say that it wants to end. But either way, it's ending in a month. And so people, if they haven't already, need to fill out the census and go to 2020census.gov and fill it out. So that's my spiel on both of those things.
Thank you. Martha, what say you?
Thanks. I appreciate Ari's points, because I think you did manage to get to the local question in a sense, right? Which is that when we, ask about the Electoral College and we appreciate, right, the ways in which it functions to suppress and to negate the weight of votes in a presidential contest. I think the danger there, right, is precisely that we discourage folks from appreciating that same ballot, right, includes all those down ballot races where I do think it is still possible to discern, to organize, to force the outcome, right, at the polls, even when it feels like the presidential contest is overly determined. So I did just want to underscore that. On the question of what voting means, I'd be interested in what other folks think. I'm going to tell you what comes to mind for me, because I've been reading testimonies and memoirs and memorials, some of them coming from African-American elders about their first votes in the years after the Voting Rights Act is adopted. I've been reading those from immigrant Americans who only after naturalization vote for the first time, perhaps in their lives, in the first time in the US. And the Brennan Center for Justice has has put together a beautiful collection of essays by formerly incarcerated folks about the restoration of voting rights and the meaning of the vote. And in all those examples, if we take, Americans at their word, right, for what it is that the vote does, right, is that it confers a kind of civic belonging that is valuable, treasured, meaningful, and is in a sense a gateway to all sorts of civic engagement that may or may not be the net result of casting a ballot. It is, the gateway to, showing up at your local school board meeting, right, and having a voice on that level. It is the gateway to running for office. Many things, I think, flow from the deep and significant symbolic value of not only the possession of voting rights, but the exercise of voting rights. And while I think those things are sometimes hard to quantify, at least for a historian, they're hard to quantify, I think that those testimonies speak powerfully to me about the ways in which they function to transform our sensibilities about who we are in this very troubled, roiling, but very present experiment in democracy.
Thank you. Liz.
I really appreciate this answer that you were just giving, Martha, about the importance or the significance or the meaning of voting and of the vote. I'm going to be a little theological for a second. I am a biblical scholar and a pastor, and we've just been in the High Holy season for the Jewish people, and I have a number of rabbi friends who have taught me that the word for voice is the same word in Hebrew for vote. So when the people in biblical times and today cry out for justice, one of the ways, kind of language-wise, is through voting. Now, we all know that voting and electoral politics isn't necessarily everything. But what we also know is that if voting didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying so hard to suppress and steal votes now, and wouldn't have throughout history, had this this kind of duel of violence and voter suppression that has gone hand in hand for all movements and disenfranchised people throughout history. And so, that brings me then to this question about local and state elections. And I know already a lot has been said, and I just want to affirm it. Those voter suppression laws that have been enacted on a state level. The bans on letting municipalities pay their workers a living wage, that's happening on a state and local level. The anti-LGBTQ laws that are being passed, for the most part, are happening on a state level. So many of the most regressive policies are happening on a state level. And when you pass progressive, bold, visionary legislation on a state level, it has a life of not just the term of of the presidential kind of edict, right? It's in law, right? It's there. And so our local and state elections matter, and our organizing on a local and state level matters. Now, we all know that then if we're going to go and vote on a local and state level, we better vote on the federal level. But what matters a lot in this election is actually those state elections, because of what Ari talked about in terms of who's going to get to vote for years to come and how those voting maps are going to be drawn, but everything from the fact that we have a Senate right now that has been holding up passing any real stimulus. We have a Senate right now that is blocking healthcare, that is blocking kind of the real change that so many people, the majority of people in this country, need, and they have the power to do something about that. And so we have to have the power then to do something about them. I have a favorite quote from Dr. King, or I have many, but one of them is that power for poor people will really mean having the assertiveness, the aggressiveness, and the togetherness to make those in our power structures say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. And so voting isn't the last step. It's that you vote and then you push. And that's what those that have come before in social justice movements have always done. The Voting Rights Act doesn't happen in an election year, right? It happens because people voted and then they pushed, and then they pushed some more, and then they pushed some more. And we're living in a time where we got to vote, and we got to vote on those local and state elections, and then we're going to have to push no matter who is in office, and we're going to have to keep on pushing. But what we know is that when we push, we can actually win. We can win living wages. We can win, real police reform. We can win real immigration reform. We can win, healthcare for everybody, and all of these issues that matter so much.
Thank you. Carol.
And I guess what I would say is that I wouldn't see it as either or, is that we have to vote up ballot and down ballot and through the ballot, because all of those segments are working together to create an America where we can either have access to quality, affordable health care, or we won't. Where we can have really good, strong public schools, or we don't. Because who the president is appointing in these key cabinet positions has a lot to do with the policies that affect us. Who is elected in the Senate has a lot to do with the confirmation hearings that are going on with the judges that are going to be there, because part of the strategy that is happening now is I firmly believe that they know that with the power of the demographic changes happening in America, and with the organizing that is happening, and with the kind of sense of we are done that is happening, is that the voter suppression techniques cannot hold back the tide, not forever. And so the strategy then is to say, okay, we know we're going to eventually lose the executive branch. We're going to eventually lose the legislative branch. But if we have the judiciary and we stock it with these right-wing ideologues, more of whom have been voted as deemed unqualified by the American Bar Association, but they're young enough so that they can block all of the legislation coming through. That means we can see the kind of dismantling that we saw after Reconstruction by the Supreme Court, that gutted, that eviscerated the 14th and the 15th Amendment, as well as the Force Acts and the Enforcement Acts. But what we also know is we're crying out for justice, is that these local elections for mayors and DAs and sheriffs have a significant impact on what justice is going to look like. And so it is all the way through. That is how, and so I'm just going to end with an analogy that the way I've been thinking about this, which is right now we have a system of massive voter suppression where they only want the sopranos to be singing. Imagine a choir of only sopranos, because it's not only sopranos that are singing, but it's only the music that sopranos can sing. So we're not even getting the full, hymnal. We're not getting the full choir book. We're just getting what sopranos can sing. But if we have the kind of democracy we deserve, then we're having a choir that is composed of baritones and basses and tenors and altos. And all of a sudden, the music is so vibrant, it is so rich. And the music that is being sung is not now just only for the sopranos. That means that the policies aren't just for the sopranos. That's what voting can do. So it's voting plus holding folks accountable, and it's voting all the way through that ballot.
Wow, thank you. We have, and those are incredible answers and really great notes in some ways to end on. We have this awkward 2 minutes of time. What I really want to do is give you like 30 seconds each, lightning round, MSNBC style, final thoughts. But because the questions remaining run the gamut from the 13th Amendment to everything, Pan-Africanism, so many questions. But if there's anything that you didn't get to say that you want to say, maybe in just 30 seconds each now, this would be the time. Liz.
I want to say that if folks are trying to be involved in voting rights battles and mobilizing and organizing and registering and educating people in this election, please connect up with lots of amazing local organizing, but also come to the Poor People's Campaign. You can go to poorpeoplescampaign.org/voting and sign up to be a poll monitor, all kinds of stuff that actually speaks to many of the questions that we left unanswered.
Well done. Ari.
I would just say that all the suppression we're seeing, all the attacks on the legitimacy of the election that we're seeing is a recognition by those that are doing it that they're losing, that they're afraid of people voting. So I would say it is overwhelming, it is disturbing, but it's also a recognition of the power you have, that the one thing they don't want you to do is vote, which is why it's more important to do it in record numbers and to make a plan now for how you're going to vote. If you're going to vote by mail, you absolutely need to request your absentee ballot right away. You need to send it back right away. You need to drop it off if possible, before they start closing even more locations to drop your ballot off like they just did in Texas today. If you're going to vote in person, many states, 40 states have early voting. Go vote early when it's easier to social distance, when there's shorter lines to the polls. It's a lot easier to solve issues 30 days before the election than it is 3 days before the election or on election day. And I don't think the question in this election is, will people vote? I think people will vote. The question is, will their votes be counted? And the more we can do now to demand that our votes are counted and to get in there in such record numbers that they can't then nullify those votes after, that's the way that we're going to see the change that we need to see in this election.
Thank you. Carol.
What he said, it really is. Make a plan. Vote early. I have already voted. I used my absentee ballot, and then I went to the drop box and I checked online, and my vote has been accepted. And so this is make a plan. Yes, this is make a plan. Check, make sure you're registered to vote. Know that there are organizations, and if you run into trouble, 1-866 Our Vote is the place to go that provides the kind of support you need to handle whatever happens. But voting, do not cede your power.
Martha,
This is our power. Yes.
I concur, but I will add that I think it is essential to keep our sights high, to remember our best ideals. However we get through this November, we continue to live in a country that does not guarantee to any of us the vote by design. And the door is always open to states to interfere, suppress, and otherwise deny us access to the polls. I'm someone who has advocated for a constitutional amendment that guarantees to every American a ballot, the capacity to cast it, and then the promise that it will be counted. And while that may sound far-reaching in a strife-filled election cycle like November 2020, it is essential that we hold on to our highest ideals, even as we get down and do the nitty-gritty work of this particular voting year.
Thank you. You did it. And thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. Please don't forget to pick up copies of One Person, No Vote, of Give Us the Ballot, Vanguard, and Revive Us Again, the books by our amazing panelists. Thank you to the panelists, to co-moderator, co-host Jean Theoharis, and thanks to everybody who donated to the Schomburg Center through Eventbrite. You can also support the work of our education department at schomburgcenter.org/support-education. Stay safe, everyone, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.